Keanu Reeves was in town and everyone was talking about it. For most, it was just another celebrity sighting, a fleeting moment of excitement in their otherwise ordinary lives. But for Lucas, a 10-year-old boy living in a crowded orphanage, it meant something entirely different. For Lucas, it was hope. With nothing but a battered notebook filled with dreams and a heart full of determination, he made a choice that would set off a chain of events no one could have predicted. What started as a desperate attempt to meet his hero would soon turn into a story that left not only Lucas, but even Keanu himself questioning everything. Before we continue this story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you enjoy heartfelt stories like this, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this story, so after watching, leave a comment below and tell us what you think. And don't forget, tomorrow, we have another inspiring story just for you. 10-year-old Lucas sat on the edge of a cracked wooden bench in the crowded orphanage yard, his hands clasping an old, tattered notebook. The pages inside were filled with his drawings of imagined movie scenes. Heroes leaping from buildings, intense chase sequences, and grand explosions, all brought to life by his vivid imagination. For as long as Lucas could remember, he had dreamed of being an actor, someone who could bring stories to life and inspire others, just like his favorite star, Keanu Reeves. Lucas had first discovered Keanu Reeves when he was 6 years old, sitting with his parents on a worn-out sofa in their tiny apartment. They had gathered every Friday for movie night, a sacred family tradition. Lucas's dad would always pick a film with action and heart, while his mom provided the snacks, often popcorn and homemade lemonade. That night, the movie was The Matrix, and it left a mark on Lucas's soul. As his parents laughed, cheered, and mimicked the iconic fight scenes, Lucas felt a deep sense of joy that he hadn't known could exist. But those days were long gone. When Lucas was just 7, a devastating fire had swept through their apartment. The flames had stolen not only his home, but also his parents, leaving him an orphan with nothing but memories. The trauma of that night lingered in his mind, replaying in his dreams. The smell of smoke, the sound of his mother's desperate screams, and the way his father had shielded him from the flames. Lucas had survived, but at a cost. The light in his world had dimmed, and though the orphanage provided a roof over his head, it couldn't fill the gaping void in his heart. Now, the days in the orphanage blurred together, monotonous and cold. The caregivers were kind, but their attention was divided among dozens of children, each with their own struggles. Lucas felt invisible most of the time, a shadow among shadows. The other kids didn't understand him, often teasing him for his habit of sketching movie ideas in his notebook or reciting lines from old films. "Dreams don't put food on the table," one of the older boys had sneered at him once, but Lucas clung to those dreams fiercely. They were all he had left. One rainy afternoon, while Lucas was sketching a new idea in the corner of the orphanage's common room, he overheard two caregivers chatting. Their voices were soft, but his sharp ears caught a name that made him freeze. Keanu Reeves. His heart leapt. He sat perfectly still, straining to hear more. "In town for the week," one caregiver said. "They're filming something downtown. Can you imagine meeting someone like him? Such a good guy." Lucas's pencil dropped from his hand. "Keanu Reeves? Here?" He couldn't believe it. For the first time in years, he felt something stir inside him, a spark of hope. Meeting Keanu Reeves felt impossible, but if there was even the slightest chance, he had to try. Maybe, just maybe, he could tell Keanu about his dream and ask for advice. He wanted to know if someone like him, an orphan, a boy with no connections, could ever make it in a world that seemed so far out of reach. That night, Lucas lay in his small bed, staring at the cracked ceiling above him. His mind raced with possibilities. How would he find Keanu? What would he say? The practical part of him knew it was foolish, even reckless, but his heart screamed that this might be his only chance to feel connected to the happiness he had lost. He imagined Keanu's calm voice and kind smile, the way he always seemed to be a source of light for others. "This is my chance," Lucas whispered to himself. "If I don't try, I'll regret it forever." The next morning, he woke up early, his mind made up. After breakfast, he snuck into the staff room and found a newspaper on the table. Sure enough, there was a small article about the film production, along with the location of the main set. It wasn't far from the orphanage, just a few streets away in the heart of the city. Lucas folded the page carefully and slipped it into his pocket. He spent the rest of the day planning. He didn't have much, a faded jacket, a small backpack, and his notebook, but it would have to be enough. As night fell and the other children drifted off to sleep, Lucas sat by the window, staring out at the city lights. He took a deep breath, clutching his notebook tightly. "This is for you, Mom and Dad," he murmured. "I'll make you proud." And with that, he slipped quietly out of the orphanage, his heart pounding with equal parts fear and excitement. The streets were dark and cold, but Lucas moved with determination, guided by a dream that refused to die. He didn't know how, but he was certain of one thing. He was going to meet Keanu Reeves. Whatever it took. Lucas wandered through the city streets, the sound of his sneakers tapping softly against the pavement. The early morning air was crisp, the sun still hiding beneath the horizon, casting a faint gray over the world. His fingers clutched the newspaper scrap tightly, the smudged print his only guide. He'd studied the location over and over, memorizing the street names and landmarks. Maple Street, just past the old theater, he muttered to himself, his voice trembling with nervous energy. The closer he got, the more anxious he became. What if he wasn't allowed anywhere near the set? What if Keanu wasn't there today? A dozen doubts swirled in his mind, but he pushed them aside, focusing on each step forward. This wasn't just a whim, it was his dream. His one chance to connect with someone who felt like a piece of his past and his future all at once. When he finally turned the corner onto Maple Street, the scene before him made him freeze in awe. Bright lights illuminated the street like a miniature sun, casting long shadows across the ground. Dozens of people bustled around, a blur of cameras, tripods, and microphones. A food truck hummed on the side, and clusters of crew members in headsets shouted instructions to one another. It was a world Lucas had only ever imagined, and now he was standing on its edge. But where was Keanu? Lucas scanned the crowd desperately, his eyes darting from one figure to the next. Everyone was dressed in dark jackets or holding equipment, none of them resembling the calm, familiar face he'd seen in so many movies. For a moment, panic gripped him. What if this had all been a mistake? "Hey, kid!" A gruff voice startled him. Lucas turned sharply to see a large man in a bright orange vest holding a clipboard and glaring at him. What are you doing here? This is a closed set. You can't just wander in." I'm sorry," Lucas stammered, taking a step back. I was hoping to—" "No visitors," the man interrupted, his tone firm. "Get back behind the barricades, now." Lucas's cheeks burned with embarrassment as he mumbled an apology and shuffled back toward the metal barriers that lined the street. Other spectators, mostly adults, stood behind them, craning their necks to catch a glimpse of the action. Lucas squeezed between two taller people, his small frame fitting easily through the gaps. From here, he could see more of the set, but there was still no sign of Keanu. Minutes felt like hours as he stood there, his hope beginning to waver. He tried to stay positive, telling himself that Keanu would appear any second now, but the more time passed, the more his doubts grew. Maybe this was a terrible idea. Maybe he'd come all this way for nothing. And then he saw him. Keanu Reeves stepped out of a black SUV parked at the far end of the street, his tall frame unmistakable even from a distance. He wore a simple black coat and jeans, his hair slightly tousled. Lucas's breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he couldn't move, his legs rooted to the ground. It was like seeing a star fall from the sky, unreal and breathtaking. "Anu!" someone in the crowd shouted, and a ripple of excitement spread through the spectators. Phones shot into the air, eager to capture the moment. Lucas gripped the barrier tightly, his heart pounding so loudly he could hear it in his ears. This was it. He had to act now. But how? As Keanu walked toward the set, surrounded by security and crew members, Lucas knew he had no chance of reaching him from here. The barriers were too high, the crowd too thick. He needed another way. His eyes darted around the area, searching for an opening, and then he saw it. A narrow alley that ran parallel to the set. It wasn't blocked off, and if he followed it, he might be able to get closer to where Keanu was heading. Without hesitating, Lucas ducked out of the crowd and slipped into the alley. The air was colder here, the shadows darker, but he pressed on, the sound of his own footsteps echoing around him. At the end of the alley, he found himself just a few feet from the edge of the set, hidden behind a stack of equipment crates. From here, he could see Keanu clearly. The actor was speaking with a director, his calm demeanor and easy smile, exactly as Lucas had imagined. This was his chance. "Keanu," Lucas whispered at first. Then louder, "Keanu Reeves." Keanu didn't hear him over the noise of the set, but a security guard nearby did. The man's head snapped toward Lucas, his eyes narrowing as he began to approach. Panic surged through Lucas. He couldn't let this end here. Summoning every ounce of courage he had, Lucas darted out from behind the crates and into the open. "Keanu!" he shouted, his voice breaking. The sudden movement and the sound of his cry caught everyone's attention. Crew members turned to look, and the security guard broke into a sprint, his voice booming. "Hey, kid! Stop!" Keanu glanced up, startled, his eyes locking onto the small figure running toward him. Lucas felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. This was too important. "Keanu, please, I just want to talk to you," he yelled, tears stinging his eyes. Before the security guard could reach him, Lucas skidded to a halt just a few feet away from the actor, his chest heaving. The world seemed to stand still as Keanu stepped forward, raising a hand to stop the guard. "It's okay," Keanu said, his voice calm and steady. He crouched slightly to meet Lucas's wide, tear-galled eyes. "Hey there, buddy. What's going on? Why are you here?" Lucas's heart was racing, but for the first time in years, he felt like he could finally breathe. Lucas stared up at Keanu, his heart pounding in his chest. For a moment he couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the reality of standing face to face with his hero. The noise of the set, the murmurs of the crew, even the shouts from the security guard, all of it faded into the background. It was just him and Keanu. Keanu, kneeling slightly to meet Lucas at eye level, tilted his head and offered a kind smile. "What's your name, little man?" he asked, his voice calm and patient. "I'm Lucas," the boy stammered, clutching the strap of his backpack tightly. "I'm sorry for running out like that. I needed to talk to you." Keanu nodded, his expression softening further. "It's okay, Lucas. Take a deep breath. You've got my attention. What's on your mind?" Lucas hesitated, his throat dry. This was it, the moment he'd dreamed of, but now that it was here, he didn't know how to start. He glanced around nervously, noticing the curious stares of the crew. The weight of their eyes made him shrink back slightly, but Keanu placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Don't worry about them," Keanu said, his tone reassuring. "It's just us. Tell me what you're thinking." Encouraged by the actor's warmth, Lucas took a deep breath and began. "I've always wanted to be an actor," he said, his voice shaky but growing stronger with each word. "Ever since I was little, my parents and I would watch movies together. Your movies. My dad would pretend to be you doing all these funny fight scenes, and my mom would laugh so much." A faint smile crossed Lucas's face as he spoke, the memory briefly lifting the heavy weight in his chest. But then, his voice faltered, and his gaze dropped to the ground. "Then they died. There was a fire, and I lost them." Tears welled in his eyes, but he quickly wiped them away, refusing to break down in front of Keanu. "Now I live in an orphanage, and it's so hard. Everyone says I'm just a kid with silly dreams, but I can't let it go. Acting is all I've ever wanted." Keanu listened intently, his brow furrowing with empathy. He didn't interrupt, letting Lucas pour his heart out. When Lucas finally looked up, his face flushed from emotion, Keanu gave him a small nod. "That's a lot for someone your age to carry," Keanu said gently. "I'm sorry about your parents, Lucas. They sound like they were incredible people." He paused, glancing at the crew and security nearby. "Tell you what, how about we step over there where it's quieter? We can talk without all these distractions." Lucas blinked in surprise, unsure if he'd heard correctly. "Really?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Keanu smiled. "Really?" With a wave of his hand, Keanu gestured to the security guard, who hesitated before stepping back. The actor led Lucas to a small area near the edge of the set, away from prying eyes. He crouched down again, meeting Lucas's gaze. "All right," Keanu said, his tone soft but serious. "Tell me more. Why acting? What does it mean to you? Lucas clutched the notebook in his hands, feeling its familiar weight give him strength. It's the only thing that makes me feel alive, he admitted. When I watch movies, it's like I can forget everything. The orphanage, the loneliness, all of it. I want to give that feeling to other people, just like you do. I want to make them happy, even if it's just for a little while. Keanu's eyes softened, and for a moment he seemed lost in thought. Then he nodded slowly. You know, Lucas, I get that. Movies, they're not just stories. They're a way to connect with people, to make them feel something real. And if that's what you want to do, I think that's a pretty amazing dream. Lucas's heart swelled at the words. But how? He asked, his voice filled with desperation. I don't have money for classes or a way to get started. Everyone says it's impossible. Keanu leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. I won't lie to you, Lucas. It's not easy. It takes a lot of hard work, and sometimes it feels like the odds are stacked against you. But you've got something special. He tapped the notebook Lucas held. That fire in you, that determination. It's more important than anything money can buy. Lucas bit his lip, hope flickering in his chest. Do you really think I can do it? I do, Keanu said firmly. But you can't do it alone. Everyone needs a little help along the way. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card, handing it to Lucas. This is the number for someone I trust. A great acting coach. Tell them I sent you and they'll help you get started. No cost. I'll make sure of it. Lucas stared at the card in disbelief. You mean it? He asked, his voice trembling. Keanu smiled. I wouldn't say it if I didn't. For the first time in years, Lucas felt a surge of genuine hope. He clutched the card tightly, his fingers trembling. Thank you, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you so much. Keanu placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder, his gaze steady. You've got a bright future ahead of you, Lucas. Just keep that fire alive, okay? Don't let anyone tell you your dreams don't matter. Lucas nodded, tears streaming down his cheeks. For the first time, he felt seen, not as a burden or a shadow, but as someone with potential. And as he looked up at Keanu, he silently vowed to himself, I won't let this chance go to waste. The moment was interrupted by a voice calling Keanu back to the set. He glanced over his shoulder, then back at Lucas. I've got to go, but you take care of yourself, all right? Lucas nodded again, watching as Keanu rose to his full height and walked back toward the bustling crew. For a long time, Lucas stood there, clutching the card like it was a lifeline. The world around him felt brighter, the air lighter. For the first time since his parents' death, Lucas felt like maybe, just maybe, everything was going to be okay. The days following Lucas's encounter with Keanu felt like a dream. Every time he opened his notebook, the card Keanu had given him seemed to shine brighter. He memorized the coach's name and number, repeating it to himself like a mantra. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a wall he couldn't climb. But reality, as Lucas soon realized, had a way of throwing obstacles in the path of even the brightest dreams. It started with Mrs. Beasley, the orphanage's head matron. Lucas sat nervously in her cramped office, gripping the card in his hand, his palms slick with sweat. He had spent the entire day rehearsing what he would say, but now that he was here, his words felt tangled in his throat. I met someone, Lucas finally managed. Keanu Reeves, he gave me this. He held out the card like a sacred artifact. It's for an acting coach. He said they can help me. Mrs. Beasley raised an eyebrow, adjusting her glasses as she inspected the card. Keanu Reeves? She repeated skeptically. You're telling me you met the Keanu Reeves and he gave you this? Yes, Lucas exclaimed, leaning forward in his seat. I swear, it's real. He said I could go to the coach for free. Mrs. Beasley let out a sigh, placing the card on her desk. Lucas, I know you're excited, but things like this, they're not as simple as they seem. Even if this card is real, acting isn't a reliable path. You need to focus on practical goals, things that can actually lead to a stable future. Lucas's heart sank. But I can do it, he protested. Keanu said I have potential. Keanu doesn't know your situation, Mrs. Beasley said, her tone softening. We have rules here, Lucas. We can't let you go running around the city chasing dreams. What if something happens to you? Tears of frustration welled in Lucas's eyes. But this isn't just a dream. It's my chance. Please, Mrs. Beasley, I'll do whatever it takes. Just let me try. Her expression wavered for a moment, but then she shook her head firmly. I'm sorry, Lucas. I can't allow it. The rejection hit Lucas like a punch to the gut. He trudged back to his room, the card clutched in his hand, as doubt crept into his mind. Maybe Mrs. Beasley was right. Maybe he was foolish to think he could become an actor. He stared at his notebook, the once bright pages now seeming dull and lifeless. For the first time in years, he felt the familiar weight of hopelessness returning. But that night, as he lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Lucas remembered the look in Keanu's eyes, the steady, unwavering belief he had shown. Don't let anyone tell you your dreams don't matter, Keanu had said. The words echoed in Lucas's mind, reigniting the spark in his chest. He couldn't give up, not now. The next morning, Lucas woke with a renewed determination. If the orphanage wouldn't support him, he would find another way. During free time, he snuck into the office and used the landline to call the number on the card. His hands trembled as the phone rang, each second feeling like an eternity. Hello? A voice answered, warm but professional. Lucas took a deep breath. Hi, my name's Lucas. Keanu Reeves gave me your number. He said you're an acting coach. There was a brief pause, then a surprised chuckle. Keanu? Well, that's unexpected. Yes, I'm an acting coach. My name's Lisa. How can I help you? Lucas's words tumbled out in a rush. He explained everything, his dream, his life in the orphanage, the meeting with Keanu. Lisa listened patiently, her tone growing softer as the story unfolded. Well, Lucas, she said when he finished, it sounds like you've been through a lot. If Keanu sent you, then I'd be happy to help. When can you come in for a session? Lucas's heart leapt. Really? You mean it? Of course, Lisa said. Dreams are important, Lucas. Let's make yours happen. Getting to the acting studio, however, proved to be a challenge. Lucas couldn't just ask permission again, and sneaking out of the orphanage was risky. But he was determined. Late one afternoon, he waited until the caregivers were distracted, then slipped through the back gate. The city streets stretched out before him, noisy and bustling, but Lucas moved quickly, his heart pounding with both fear and excitement. When he arrived at the studio, Lisa greeted him with a warm smile. She was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a contagious energy. Welcome, Lucas, she said, ushering him inside. Let's see what you've got. The studio was small but cozy, with mirrors lining the walls and a few folding chairs scattered about. For the first time in his life, Lucas felt like he belonged somewhere. Lisa guided him through simple exercises, teaching him how to use his voice, his body, and his emotions to bring characters to life. You've got raw talent, Lisa said after their first session. It's rare to see someone so young with such focus. Keep working hard and you can go far. Lucas beamed at the praise. He left the studio that day feeling like he was on top of the world. But the consequences of his actions were waiting for him back at the orphanage. When Lucas returned, Mrs. Beasley was waiting in the hallway, her arms crossed and her expression stern. Where have you been, Lucas? She demanded. Do you have any idea how worried we were? Lucas froze, guilt washing over him. I went to the acting coach, he admitted quietly. I had to, Mrs. Beasley sighed, pinching the bridge of her nose. We've been over this. You can't just leave without permission. This is exactly why I didn't want you getting your hopes up. It's not just hope, Lucas cried, his voice rising. I'm working for it. I'm trying. Why can't you see that? Because the world isn't fair, Lucas, Mrs. Beasley snapped, her voice uncharacteristically harsh. You think Keanu Reeves will come swooping in to fix everything? Life doesn't work like that. Her words cut deep, but Lucas stood his ground. Maybe it doesn't, he said, his voice trembling. But I have to try anyway. Even if no one believes in me. Mrs. Beasley stared at him for a long moment, her expression softening. She let out a weary sigh. You're a stubborn one, Lucas. I'll give you that. But stubbornness can only take you so far. Lucas didn't respond, but inside, he knew one thing for sure. No matter what, he wouldn't stop chasing his dream, even if the whole world stood in his way. Days passed in tense silence after Lucas's argument with Mrs. Beasley. Though he continued to sneak out to meet Lisa for his acting sessions, the weight of her disapproval hung heavy on his shoulders. Each time he returned to the orphanage, he braced for another confrontation, but Mrs. Beasley seemed to have resigned herself to simply watching him with a mix of concern and frustration. The strain began to wear on Lucas. The joy he felt at Lisa's studio was now tempered by the fear that his dream might ultimately lead to more trouble than it was worth. He couldn't shake Mrs. Beasley's words. "The world isn't fair, Lucas." Was he setting himself up for heartbreak? One afternoon, after a particularly grueling acting exercise, Lucas sat on the floor of the studio, staring at his notebook. Lisa noticed the change in his demeanor. "What's on your mind, Lucas?" she asked gently. "I'm starting to think..." Lucas hesitated, his voice low. "Maybe everyone's right. Maybe this is just a stupid dream. No one believes in me, except you and Keanu. But what if I'm wasting everyone's time?" Lisa knelt beside him, her expression serious. "Listen to me, Lucas. Every great actor, every great artist has doubted themselves at some point. But they kept going because their passion mattered more than their fear. You're not wasting anyone's time, least of all your own. Do you believe in yourself?" Lucas thought about Keanu's words. "Don't let anyone tell you your dreams don't matter." He clenched his fists and nodded. "I do." "Good," Lisa said, smiling. "That's all you need to keep going." Later that evening, Lucas returned to the orphanage to find Mrs. Beasley waiting by the front door, her arms crossed. "We need to talk, Lucas," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. Lucas's stomach churned. He followed her to her office where she gestured for him to sit. "This sneaking out has to stop," she began. "I know you think this acting coach is your ticket to a better future, but you're putting yourself in danger. If something happens to you out there, we'll all be responsible." "I'm careful," Lucas protested. "I know the risks, but this is my only chance. Please, Mrs. Beasley, just give me a little more time. I'll prove that I can make this work." Mrs. Beasley sighed heavily. "Lucas, it's not about proving anything. It's about keeping you safe. You're still a child." Lucas's frustration boiled over. "I'm not just a kid. I'm trying to do something with my life, and no one will let me." The argument escalated until Mrs. Beasley, visibly upset, told Lucas to go to his room. Feeling suffocated, Lucas stormed out of the office. His thoughts were a whirlwind of anger and despair as he climbed out the orphanage window and ran into the cold night. Lucas wandered the streets aimlessly, the city lights blurring through the tears in his eyes. He didn't care where he was going, he just needed to get away. But as the night wore on, the streets grew quieter, darker, and unfamiliar. Turning into an alley, Lucas suddenly realized he wasn't alone. A group of older teenagers loitered near a dumpster, their voices low and rough. Lucas froze, realizing too late that he'd caught their attention. "Well, what do we have here?" one of them sneered, stepping toward Lucas. "Just passing through," Lucas said quickly, trying to back away. "And so fast," another said. "You lost, kid? Or just looking for trouble?" Lucas's heart pounded as the group surrounded him. Panic surged through him. He tried to explain, but his words faltered under their taunts. Then one of them grabbed his backpack, yanking it off his shoulders. "Hey, give that back!" Lucas shouted, reaching for it. "Relax, kid. Let's see what you're hiding in here," the teenager said, rummaging through the bag. When he pulled out Lucas's notebook and the card Keanu had given him, Lucas lunged forward, desperate to retrieve them. "Leave him alone." The voice was calm but commanding, and it made everyone freeze. Lucas turned toward the sound, his eyes widening in shock. Standing at the mouth of the alley was Keanu Reeves, his tall frame silhouetted against the streetlights. The teenagers hesitated, exchanging uneasy glances. "What's it to you?" one of them challenged. Keanu stepped closer, his expression steady but intense. "Let the kid go," he said firmly, "and give him his stuff." The group wavered for a moment before one of them tossed Lucas's bag to the ground. "Fine, whatever, let's get out of here." the leader muttered, and they scattered into the shadows. Keanu waited until they were gone before kneeling to pick up the bag. He handed it to Lucas, his expression softening. "You okay, buddy?" Lucas clutched the bag to his chest, his voice trembling. I didn't think I'd see you again." Keanu smiled faintly. "I didn't think I'd see you here either. What are you doing out so late?" Lucas hesitated, then blurted out everything. His fight with Mrs. Beasley, his doubts about his dream, and how lost he felt. Keanu listened patiently, his gaze never leaving Lucas. "Lucas," Keanu said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder, "you've got the heart of a fighter. But you can't do this alone. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let people help you." Lucas nodded, tears streaming down his face. For the first time that night, he felt safe. Keanu placed an arm around him and led him back toward the main street. "Come on," Keanu said, "let's get you home." The ride back to the orphanage was quiet, the city's lights streaming past the car windows. Lucas sat in the passenger seat, his bag clutched tightly to his chest. Keanu's calm presence beside him felt like a shield against the turmoil of the night. For the first time in hours, Lucas began to feel the weight of his exhaustion settle over him. And "You're a brave kid, you know that?" Keanu said, breaking the silence. "Most people would have given up a long time ago, but you kept going." Lucas glanced at him, unsure how to respond. I don't know what else to do," he admitted softly. "This dream is all I have." Keanu nodded thoughtfully. "Dreams are powerful, but you're not alone in this. There are people who care about you, even when it feels like they don't." Lucas frowned. "Mrs. Beasley doesn't understand. She thinks I'm just being reckless." "She's worried about you," Keanu said gently. "And honestly, she's got a point. Running around the city at night isn't safe. But that doesn't mean your dream doesn't matter. It just means you need to find a better way to chase it." When they arrived at the orphanage, the lights in the building were still on. Mrs. Beasley stood by the front door, her arms crossed and her expression a mixture of worry and relief. As Lucas stepped out of the car, her gaze softened and she hurried toward him. "Lucas!" she exclaimed. "Are you all right? Where have you been?" Before Lucas could answer, Keanu stepped forward. "He's okay," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's been a long night, but he's safe now." Mrs. Beasley blinked, her mouth falling open slightly as she took in the sight of the Hollywood star standing before her. "Mr. Reeves?" she asked, clearly flustered. "I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Keanu replied with a small smile. "Lucas told me a bit about what's been going on. I think we can both agree he's a determined kid, maybe too much for his own good." Mrs. Beasley sighed, rubbing her temples. "He's a handful, all right, but he's also one of the most talented and passionate kids I've ever met." Keanu smiled at Lucas, then turned back to Mrs. Beasley. "That passion is something special. It's worth nurturing. I'd like to help." The next morning, Keanu met with Mrs. Beasley and Lucas in her office. Over coffee and quiet conversation, Keanu outlined a plan. He would personally fund Lucas's acting lessons with Lisa and ensure he had safe transportation to and from her studio. More importantly, he would keep in regular contact with both Lucas and Mrs. Beasley to make sure everything stayed on track. "I want to make this dream achievable without putting him in danger," Keanu explained. "With a little structure and support, he can focus on growing into the actor he wants to be." Mrs. Beasley hesitated, glancing at Lucas, who sat silently, his eyes wide with hope. Finally, she nodded. "All right," she said softly. "But only if Lucas agrees to follow the rules. No more sneaking out, no more running off." Lucas nodded vigorously. "I promise," he said. "Thank you, Mrs. Beasley, and thank you, Mr. Reeves." The weeks that followed were transformative for Lucas. With Keanu's support and Mrs. Beasley's cautious approval, he threw himself into his lessons with Lisa. She pushed him harder with each session, challenging him to explore his emotions and refine his craft. At the orphanage, Lucas noticed a change in the way the other kids looked at him. Where there had once been teasing, there was now curiosity and even admiration. For the first time, Lucas felt like he wasn't just another face in the crowd. He was someone with a purpose. Keanu stayed true to his word, checking in regularly. Sometimes it was a quick phone call, other times a handwritten note. Each time, Lucas felt a renewed sense of determination. One note in particular stuck with him. "Keep going, Lucas. The world needs your story." A year later, Lucas stood on a small stage at a community theater, his heart racing as the audience erupted into applause. His first performance had been a success. As he bowed, he caught sight of Keanu in the back row, clapping and smiling proudly. Next to him sat Mrs. Beasley, tears glistening in her eyes. When the show ended, Lucas ran to greet them. Keanu crouched down, giving him a firm handshake. "Told you you could do it," he said with a grin. Mrs. Beasley pulled Lucas into a hug. "I'm so proud of you," she whispered. "Your parents would be too." Lucas smiled, his heart full. For the first time, he truly believed it. His dream wasn't just his anymore. It was a shared triumph, a testament to the people who had believed in him when it mattered most. The morning after the eventful night, Lucas woke up in his small bed at the orphanage, the sunlight streaming through the window. The events of the previous evening felt almost surreal. Keanu Reeves rescuing him from danger and walking him back to safety. Yet the card in his backpack, the one Keanu had given him, served as a reminder that it was all real. As Lucas dressed and headed to breakfast, he found himself met with curious stares from the other children. Word had spread quickly about his late-night return in the company of a movie star. For the first time, the whispers weren't filled with ridicule, but something closer to awe. "Is it true?" one of the younger boys asked timidly. "Did you really meet Keanu Reeves?" Lucas hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah," he said with a small smile. "He's even nicer than I thought." Later that day, Mrs. Beasley called Lucas into her office. He braced himself, expecting another lecture about his reckless behavior. Instead, he found Mrs. Beasley seated across from Keanu Reeves, her expression a mix of exasperation and reluctant admiration. "Lucas," Mrs. Beasley began, "Mr. Reeves and I have been talking about you, and while I still don't agree with how you've handled things, I understand now why this is so important to you." Lucas froze, his heart pounding. "Does that mean—" "It means," Keanu said, leaning forward with a kind smile, "that we've come up with a way to support your dream, without you having to sneak out or put yourself in danger." Mrs. Beasley sighed but nodded. "Mr. Reeves has generously offered to cover the cost of your acting lessons and arrange safe transportation to and from the studio, but, Lucas, you have to follow the rules. No more running off. No more late-night adventures." Lucas's eyes widened, tears welling up as he glanced between Mrs. Beasley and Keanu. "I promise," he said earnestly. "I'll do whatever it takes. Thank you." Keanu reached over, resting a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "You've got the passion, Lucas. Now you just need the right support. We all believe in you." Over the following weeks, Lucas's life transformed. With Keanu's backing, he attended regular acting lessons with Lisa, who was more than ready to push him to new heights. Her studio became a safe haven for Lucas, a place where he could pour his energy into his craft and let his creativity thrive. Back at the orphanage, Lucas noticed a shift in how the other kids treated him. They were no longer dismissive or cruel. Some even asked to see his notebook, marveling at the intricate scenes he sketched and the dialogue he wrote. Lucas felt a sense of belonging he hadn't known was possible. Keanu stayed involved, checking in regularly through calls and visits. One afternoon, he surprised Lucas by attending one of his lessons with Lisa. As Lucas rehearsed a monologue, Keanu watched with quiet pride, offering a few pieces of advice afterward. "You've got something special, Lucas," Keanu said, handing him a worn copy of Hamlet. "Keep working hard and the world will see it too." Months turned into a year, and Lucas's progress was undeniable. He earned a small role in a local theater production, a milestone that filled him with pride. On opening night, the audience erupted into applause as the curtain fell. Lucas scanned the crowd, his heart skipping a beat when he saw Keanu sitting in the front row, clapping enthusiastically. After the show, Keanu pulled Lucas into a hug. "You were incredible," he said. "This is just the beginning." Mrs. Beasley, who had also attended the performance, wiped tears from her eyes. "Your parents would be so proud of you," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. Lucas hugged her tightly, her words settling deep into his heart. As Lucas stood outside the theater that night, the stars shining brightly above, he clutched the notebook that had carried him through his darkest days. He thought of his parents, of the laughter they had shared, and of the moment they'd first watched The Matrix together. He could almost hear his dad's voice cheering him on. Keanu placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder, breaking the quiet. "The world is going to know your name one day," he said with a grin. "Just keep being yourself." Lucas smiled, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "Thank you." "For everything." Keanu shook his head. "Don't thank me. You've done all the hard work. I just gave you a little push." As Lucas walked home with Mrs. Beasley that night, he felt a sense of peace. His dream was no longer just a fantasy. It was real, and it was his. For the first time, Lucas believed in his future. A future he would build, step by step, with the support of the people who believed in him. The world wasn't so lonely after all.